Welcome, everyone. Welcome again to Conversations with Authors and Innovators. I'm Larry Gennari, and with my co-host and partner in crime, Doug Banks from the Boston Business Journal, we are presenting recorded conversations with authors, thought leaders, and entrepreneurs. And today, Doug and I talk with Jonah Berger, Wharton professor, prolific author. You probably already know about his books Contagious, Invisible Influence, The Catalyst. His latest is Magic Words. And this is just a terrific book. And as we've said in the Boston Business Journal, a must read for business owners, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and board members, and parents too, Jonah. So, Jonah, we'll ask you a little bit about the book and what prompted you to write it. But I really would like to congratulate you on really taking all of us to a place where we take talking and words for granted. And you note throughout the book that slight changes in words can have an amazing impact. And you identify types of magic words. Tell us what those are and what prompted you to write this book.
So first of all, thank you guys so much for having me. It's great to get a chance to chat. And as you alluded to, we use language all the time. But while we think a lot about what to say, what topic we want to communicate in that email, or if we're going to make a presentation, what the big ideas we want to get across, we think a lot less about the specific words to use. And unfortunately, that's a mistake, because subtle shifts in the language use can have a big effect on our own impact. Merely adding a couple letters to the end of certain words can increase the likelihood of persuasion by about a third. Saying, I recommend something rather than I like that thing can make people about a third more likely to take your suggestion. And everything from the language used in emails at the office to the language people might use in an application for a loan provides insight about who those people are and how likely they are to behave certain ways in the future. And so in Magic Words, I talk all about kind of what these language features are and how to understand them. And as you sort of keyed up, there are 6 key types of language I talk about in the book, 6 ways to speak more effectively. It's an acronym. The S in speak is for the language of similarity and difference. The P in speak is for the language of posing questions. The E is for the language of emotion. The A is for the language of agency and identity. The first C is for the language of confidence, and the second C is for the language of concreteness. And if you're following along going, speak doesn't have 2 C's and it ends with a K, you're exactly right. I wasn't clever enough to come up with a framework that ends with K. K is a very difficult Scrabble letter, but we have 2 C's instead, and hopefully that makes the framework a little easier to remember.
Doug, you and I talked about this book. You really enjoyed topics around music, but also other aspects of this.
Yeah, so I know, Larry, you're a fan of Guy Raz, and I'm a journalist and a guy whose life and career has been around words. So I think we were both kind of dialed into that section on employing emotions in particular, Jonah. And highlighting the hurdles I thought was fascinating, where focusing on someone's shortcomings actually makes them more, not less likable. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think all of us think, whether we're leaders talking to our teams, whether we're salespeople talking to our audience, or people posting stuff online, we all think we should focus on our successes, right? If you go online these days, most social media posts are a veritable like greatest hits album. Look at me, I won this, or I met this person, or I did this thing. It's all the great stuff. And we think we need to post the great stuff because we think posting the failures or the places we messed up or didn't succeed will make us look worse, right? People will think we're not as successful and not as likable, and they won't want to interact with us. But it turns out the exact opposite is true. First of all, in our own personal lives, actually showing people that we're not perfect can make them like us more, as long as we're somewhat competent, right? If we're completely incompetent, then showing off mistakes isn't necessarily a good thing. But if we're mostly competent, if most of the time we're doing pretty competent, impressive things, showing people we screw up once in a while makes us more relatable. Makes people go, wow, like this is a real person, right? They're showing their successes and their failures. I can see myself in them, because most of us, right? Most of us have difficulties. Most of us has things we have to overcome. And so as individuals, when we see other people owning up to the places where they've hit some speed bumps, we find them much more relatable and more motivating. And second, just more broadly, as we tell stories as leaders, as individuals and organizations, or more broadly, stories aren't that interesting if all every moment is positive, right? If everything is just great and great and great. If you look at really good stories, they go a little bit more like this, right? There's a moment of success, but then there's a moment of failure, and then there's another moment of success, but another moment of failure. And you mentioned Guy Raz. I listen to his How I Built This podcast whenever I go running. He does a great job of taking people that are very successful and showing how, look, they hit a bunch of roadblocks along the way, and it wasn't always just success and success and success. There was a lot of failure before they got to that success. I work with a lot of early stage firms. I was just having a call last week, and they're having, one of the companies having trouble, and they're going, God, is this normal? We're having trouble getting traction. I'm like, yeah, look at all these other firms that have succeeded but had trouble initially. And so I think owning up to those failures makes stories better, makes people more relatable, but also helps us as audience members go, wow, if they overcame this failure to achieve this success, maybe my own failures aren't saying I'm a failure. It's just a step on the way to a later success.
Jonah, you talk about words helping people be better listeners. And I love the chapter on making things more concrete, and that you talk to lots of folks, including people who might call into a consumer-facing business and having trouble finding a shirt or shoes. Can you talk a little bit about that and give a tip?
Yeah, sure. I think many of us are recognizing that listening is a good idea, right? It's hard to find someone who doesn't think listening is a good idea. And so we all know that we should listen. What I think we know less about is how to show that we're listening, right? So we may have heard what someone said. We may have understood what someone said, but to make them feel like we're listening, we can't just hear it and understand it. We've got to show it. Right? You may have heard exactly what someone said, but if you don't verbally give them some indication that you heard it, if you don't show them, you're not necessarily going to gain the benefits of that listening. And so whether we're a customer service agent talking with a customer, or whether we're a leader talking to our team, we've got to show listening. How do we do that? And so we looked at this question in the context of customer service calls. We looked at interactions with a large online retailer when people called up with problems. It turns out even controlling for what the problem is and whether they get their money back and a variety of different things, the language they use, the words they use when talking to that customer have a big impact on customer satisfaction and whether those customers come back and buy stuff in the future. And one particularly important linguistic feature is concrete language. And what do I mean by that? Well, often a customer service agent might say something like, oh, I can help you with that. And in some sense, that's a Swiss Army piece of language, right? I can help you with that. Works if the person's calling with a canceled flight or a lost bag or a t-shirt or anything at all. I can help you with that. But it doesn't show listening. We're saying, I'll go find that t-shirt in gray, or I'll go find a better direct flight for you from Detroit to, San Francisco, whatever it might be, shows listening. Right? Compared to a situation where someone says, hey, your refund will be there soon, saying your money will be there tomorrow is much more concrete. I can imagine what money is. I get a sense of what tomorrow is.
Yeah, so subtle and so important. Yeah. And what I also liked, you talk about when we want folks to be readers, right? We don't want them just to read. I loved your advice about our kids. Yep. Stop telling your kids they're smart. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, often we want to give our kids positive feedback. But the problem is that by telling them they're smart, it makes it seem like a fixed thing. You are smart or you aren't. And if you are smart, everything should be easy. And if you aren't smart, it isn't. And the problem with that is when people get to situations where things get a little bit more difficult, if you've been told you're smart the entire time and something's difficult, you go, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I can deal with this failure. Whereas if you see failure as an opportunity to do better, you try hard, and that's who you are. You're given positive reinforcement for trying harder. You're a lot more likely to deal with that failure and move past it, not be weighed down by the failure because you think it's something about who you are, but seeing success is more like something you've got to work towards is a much better model that helps kids succeed more generally.
I think it's a terrific book. You could read it in one sitting, but there's also chapters that have really cogent advice, thoughtful perspectives, so you can read it one chapter at a time. So this is really, really well done. Jonah, what are you reading these days?
As I was mentioning before the call, I have 2 young kids, so I don't get to read as much as I'd like. But there are some books that are my favorites. So there's a great old book called Diffusion of Innovations, which is all about sort of how different things catch on that I come back to again and again, almost like a textbook. There's a another book that I love called A Matter of Taste, which is by a sociologist at Harvard that talks about how baby names tell us a lot about society and cultural trends. And there's also an old book called Made to Stick, which some of your listeners may be familiar with, which is also just a favorite of mine. Anytime we're trying to be a good communicator, how to communicate more effectively.
Oh, it's terrific. Doug, what about you? What have you been reading since we last spoke with an author or an innovator?
Well, I've been reading a few things, but the thing that I'm reading right now is The Rascal King. It's the life and times of James Michael Curley, who, for those who don't remember, was mayor and then governor. He lived from 1874 to 1958. He was jailed twice, and I think in the context of Jonah's book, Magic Words, James Michael Curley was one of those politicians who very much could speak his way in and out of trouble and was just, he had people who loved him and people who hated him, and he had the ultimate command of language, I think, in ways that, Jonah, your book, talks a lot about how politicians today, use language and to make a case, and it's just it was great. So so James Michael Curley book, The Rascal King's been on my wanting to read list for a long time. I finally picked it up a couple weeks ago. I'm still reading it.
I'll put it on mine. We're talking about language, so I want to reiterate a couple of other recommendations that I made in our recent column. Win Every Argument, Mehdi Hasan's book, The Art of Debating, Persuading, and Public Speaking, reinforces in a very different way what Jonah's been talking about here, framing things the appropriate way, using rhetoric, understanding similarities, and reaching an audience. And of course, we have to use this one, but I will use the acronym STFU, the power of keeping your mouth shut in an endlessly noisy world. Dan Lyons from Silicon Valley, writer for Silicon Valley, a really, really fun book, but also a deep book about listening, and again, reinforcing the important lessons that Jonah's book shares with readers in a very different way. So I'm going to suggest that folks who want to really sharpen the way they think about words and communicate ought to get all three of them. We've been talking today with Jonah Berger. Jonah, thank you so much for joining us. And for folks who are watching our Authors Innovators conversations, pick this up. It'll be worth the read.
Thank you, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me.